What if the greatest threat to a medieval child wasn't war, famine, or plague, but their own father? Some wore crowns. Others wore robes. A few ruled empires. And some just ruled over a single terrified child in a stone cottage. From kings who let their sons die, to monks who fathered children they never dared to love, to inquisitors who called themselves father while lighting the pyres beneath young feet. These weren't just bad dads. They were nightmares in human form. And even the ones who didn't mean to be cruel. Their silence, absence, or fear left scars deeper than any sword. This isn't just history. It's a descent into the dark heart of fatherhood, where love fails, power corrupts, and children pay the price. Welcome to the most haunting family stories medieval Europe ever hid. You won't forget these fathers. Their children never did. The halls of Winchester Castle echoed with silence, and silence always followed when something shameful had passed. It was a silence filled not with peace, but with avoidance. For in the deep corners of that stone fortress, a boy had vanished, not from sight, but from a future that was never his to hold. King John of England sat alone near the hearth, fingers curled around a goblet of wine that had long gone cold. His crown, heavy and poorly fitted, was discarded on the table beside him, as if even it had tired of the men who wore it. A smile played at the edge of his lips, not one of joy, but of smug relief, as if a thorn had finally been plucked from his side. Across the sea in Rouen, Arthur of Brittany, a boy no older than 16, had met his end. The boy who once had a claim to John's crown now lay in a nameless grave, or perhaps, no grave at all. The death of Arthur was no accident, and few believed otherwise. But in the twisted court of John, truth had long since drowned under layers of intrigue, lies, and the clinking of gold. The whisper said it all, that John had ordered the boy's murder, perhaps with his own hands, in a rage one April night in 1203. Others claimed the king watched as the deed was done, silent as stone. What mattered most was not how Arthur died, but that he did, and that John, father to his own brood, uncle to Arthur, felt not a shred of mourning. John was not new to the business of betrayal. His father, Henry II, had raised sons like weapons and thrown them at one another. Richard the Lionheart had barely trusted him. Yet John had learned little from his family's ruin. If anything, he deepened the family curse. Where other kings faltered out of mercy or guilt, John only grew colder. He was not driven by vision or duty, but by suspicion, fear, and a hunger that no crown could satisfy. His own children did not escape this chill. Of his legitimate children by Isabella of Angoulême, young Henry was the heir, quiet and observant. The boy watched his father with wary eyes and learned quickly that affection was not the currency of the Plantagenet court. Henry was rarely held, rarely praised. In court, he was a shadow behind John's robe, tolerated but not treasured. And in that silence between father and son, something withered. Then there were the bastards, numerous and scattered, with only the faintest scent of royal favor. Some he acknowledged, others he used, and most he simply forgot. For John, fatherhood was not a bond but a burden, and love was a weakness. He ruled with a clenched fist, never an open hand. The court knew this. They saw how he treated Henry, how he scoffed at his softness, how he dismissed his questions. The boy, perhaps 9 or 10 when Arthur disappeared, had asked once where his cousin had gone. John's answer was swift and sharp: he went where traitors go. And that was the end of it. Those close to John watched as he sank deeper into cruelty. His enemies called him John's soft sword, mocking his lack of battlefield glory. But within the palace, his sword was not soft. It cut reputations, alliances, and hopes. Nobles who crossed him found their lands seized. Wives of rebels were imprisoned. Even priests were not spared. And all the while, Henry stood at his side, learning that a crown was not something to earn, but something to crush others for. It is said that the night Arthur died, John slept soundly. His smile lingered well into the next day. Whether from wine or satisfaction, no one could say. But what could be said was this: a boy had died, and a father had done nothing. Worse still, he had perhaps smiled. In this world of fractured loyalties and smoldering ambitions, what was a father supposed to be? A protector. A guide. A hand to lift a child through the fire. For John, none of these mattered. He did not shape his son to rule wisely, nor did he care to. Henry was a placeholder, useful only until John could gather more power. But history, as it always does, turned the page. In October of 1216, while fleeing rebellious barons and nursing a ruinous war against his own nobles, John fell ill. Crossing the Wash in East Anglia, he lost most of his baggage and treasury to the tide, a fitting symbol of a reign drowning under its own weight. Fevered and bloated, He lay in Newark Castle, attended by monks and servants who whispered prayers he likely could not hear. And there, surrounded not by loved ones but shadows, King John died. Henry, just 9 years old, became king. The boy his father never cherished, never truly mentored, now wore the crown. And in a strange twist of fate, Henry III would go on to rule for over 50 years, far longer than his father. He would try to rule with kindness, though often without strength. Perhaps, in some quiet way, he tried to become the father his own had failed to be. But the scars were there. Not only in Henry, but in England itself. John had left behind a kingdom fractured, a people betrayed, and a legend of misrule that would echo for centuries. His barons had forced him to sign the Magna Carta in 1215, not out of idealism, but to contain a king who treated loyalty as a threat. His reputation was so foul that even chroniclers, often cautious in condemning kings, called him faithless, cruel, and contemptuous of God and men alike. So when people speak of the worst fathers in medieval history, they may think first of tyrants and murderers. But John earns his place not just for what he did, but for what he never gave. No warmth. No legacy. No love. A father is remembered not only in the blood he passes on, but in the spirit he shapes. And when John died, few wept, and fewer still remembered him as a father. The child he had feared most, Arthur, was gone. The child he had ignored, Henry, had risen. And the men who had once smiled at a boy's death left behind a kingdom that would take generations to heal. The fire in the hearth had long gone out. The hall stood empty now, echoes lost among cold stones. And somewhere, in the dark soil of history, a boy lay forgotten. Not by the world, but by the one man who should have held him close. And so the story begins. A tale not just of kings and crowns, but of broken fathers, vanished sons, and the cold silence that lingers when love is withheld. We move now to another shadow, another story. For John was not the only one. There were others, each a lesson in what power can do to a father's heart. There are kings who ruled with iron hands, and then there was Ivan. They called him Grozny, not terrible in the way of incompetence, but in the sense of awe and dread. Ivan the Terrible, the first Tsar of Russia, whose name would live for centuries as a warning, not a memory. But even tyrants can be fathers. And sometimes, the worst harm a man can do is not to his enemies, but to his own blood. It was November in the year 1581, and the Kremlin's walls stood wrapped in snow, silent and frozen. The city below murmured with rumors, as it always did. Whispers of executions, disappearances. The Tsar's wrath had been growing again, like a storm pacing behind a locked door. Inside, the walls of the palace trembled beneath the weight of something more personal than politics, something more fragile. Ivan's eldest son, Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich, was the future of Russia. He was not beloved by his father, but he was respected, at least in moments of clarity. The younger Ivan had endured his father's tempers, his erratic outbursts, his opportunity, the dreaded black-robed enforcers who carried out Ivan's purges. Through it all, the Tsarevich remained dutiful. But duty, in Ivan's court, was not always enough. It began with a quarrel, the kind that had happened many times before. The Tsar found fault with his daughter-in-law, accusing her of impropriety. Her dress was too revealing, her conduct too free. Ivan struck her in rage, perhaps causing a miscarriage. His son, horrified, confronted him. Father and son, two figures in a chamber dimly lit, separated not by space but by fear that had festered for years. The argument turned fierce. Words no prince should speak. Words no czar would tolerate. Then, it happened. Ivan raised his iron-tipped staff, ornamental, yet heavy. In a moment of fury, perhaps not fully intending the blow, perhaps entirely intending it, he struck the young man on the head. There was a sound, dull and wet. The Tsarevich collapsed, blood blooming through his hair. Silence followed, as if the Kremlin itself held its breath. The Tsar dropped the staff. His face, usually fixed in a cold scowl, twisted with something rare. Not power. Not pride. Horror. He fell to his knees. He clutched his son's body. The words are said to have poured from his lips in anguish, again and again, as if they could rewind time. Servants and priests rushed in, but it was already too late. The wound was mortal. The Tsarevich lingered for days, slipping in and out of consciousness, his father's weeping voice never far from his bedside. And then, like a candle robbed of its wax, he was gone. Russia had lost its heir, not to war, not to plague, but to a father's hand. What kind of man strikes his own legacy down in rage? To understand, we must look beyond the blow. Ivan IV was a man shaped by violence. His father died when he was 3. His mother was poisoned when he was 8. The boy grew up in a palace of wolves, where noble families clawed for power while the child prince watched, learned, and seethed. The seed of fear was planted early. When Ivan finally took power, he ruled not like a man, but like a scar, deep, twisted, and unhealed. The Oprichnina, Ivan's secret police force, was his answer to betrayal. They terrorized the land, black horses galloping through snowbound streets, dragging the accused from their homes in the dead of night. Ivan watched as his empire bled, all in the name of loyalty. He believed he was chosen by God, yet trusted no one. Not advisors, not friends, not even family. There were brief moments of brilliance. Ivan reformed the church, expanded the Russian frontier, and crushed his rivals. But these victories were built atop bodies, and in the end, the kingdom began to crack beneath him. His son had been one of the few people left who dared speak truth. The Tsarevich had grown into a competent leader, harsh, yes, but measured. He would have been a strong czar. He might have guided Russia through the storm of uncertainty that followed. But Ivan's fear, always crouching in the shadows, lashed out at even this glimmer of hope. It is strange to imagine the men who ordered mass executions sobbing at his son's deathbed. Strange, but not untrue. Tyrants may feel guilt, but they feel it too late. Ivan's grief became a ghost that haunted the palace long after the funeral bells stopped tolling. And with the heir dead, the line of succession was broken. The second son, Fyodor, was not made for rule. Timid and sickly, he lacked the will to lead. Ivan knew this. He must have known that with Ivan Ivanovich gone, he had doomed Russia to weakness. And yet, his rage had spoken louder than reason. The hand that held the staff could not be stilled by fatherhood. In the years that followed, Ivan deteriorated further. He aged rapidly, his once formidable presence reduced to a twitching figure wrapped in layers of robes, muttering to saints and ghosts. He saw betrayal in every shadow. Some say he kept his son's bloodied robes in his chambers. Others say he wandered the palace at night, whispering apologies into the cold air. When Ivan finally died in 1584, playing chess in his chambers, there was no great mourning. The throne passed to Fyodor, whose reign was brief and ineffective. The time of troubles followed, a dark chapter in Russian history, filled with famine, invasions, and false tsars. The Tsarevich might have prevented it. His death left a wound not only in his father's heart, but in the heart of Russia itself. And so we ask again, what kind of man strikes down his own son? A man who could not control the monster within. A man who mistook fear for strength. A father who ruled through violence so long that he forgot what it meant to love. The legacy of Ivan the Terrible is etched into the stones of Russian history, not only in law and war, but in the absence he left behind. In that final act of rage, he did more than kill a son. He killed a future. And no kingdom, no cathedral, no prayer could bring it back. The blood of the Tsarevich soaked not just the floor of the Kremlin, but the soul of an empire. As we leave the frostbitten corridors of Moscow behind, we travel west again. Toward other fathers, other crowns, other sins. For Ivan was not the last to destroy what he should have cherished. He was only one name in a long line of men who wore crowns but failed as fathers. And in their shadows, history whispers, quiet, cold, unforgiving. There are men whose names history remembers for bravery, and others for horror. Gilles de Rais occupies both categories, a man once lauded as a national hero, a noble knight who rode beside Joan of Arc, later unmasked as one of the most monstrous figures of medieval Europe. But in the ruins of his legacy, amid the ash and blood, there was something more silent, his daughter. A child born to a father consumed by darkness, a girl whose life was exchanged like coin, whose innocence was taken not by strangers but by the very men who should have shielded her from the shadows. In the early 1400s, Gilles de Rais was a name spoken with reverence. Born into wealth and nobility, he inherited lands, titles, and a lineage proud with blood and banners. Tall, striking, and clever, he became a model knight, admired in courts across France. But what truly elevated his status was his loyalty to Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans. He rode at her side in battle, helped lift the siege of Orleans, and was named Marshal of France for his service. At 24, Gilles stood at the height of honor. Yet beneath the armor, the man was already fraying. After Joan's execution, something in him broke. Perhaps it was grief. Perhaps it was the unraveling of a purpose too closely tied to something so tragically lost. He withdrew from the battlefield and retreated into his sprawling estates, where he built a theatrical court of luxury and bizarre entertainment. He poured vast fortunes into alchemy, the occult, and increasingly disturbing personal indulgences. And there, behind the high walls of Chateau de Tiffauges and other castles he owned, the transformation began. Gilles married Catherine de Thouars, a noblewoman of good standing. From that union came a daughter, Marie. For a time, she lived at court among music, books, and silk-lined chambers. But even then, servants whispered of the oddities surrounding the lord. The strange men who visited in the dead of night. The children from the village who entered the castle and never returned. And as the years passed, the whispers grew louder. What Gillis did behind those walls remains one of history's most chilling catalogues of cruelty. He lured peasant children, boys and girls, into his castles under promises of food, clothing, or work. Once inside, they were tortured, mutilated, and murdered. By his own confession, the number may have reached into the hundreds. Some accounts say he relished their fear. Others suggest he believed their deaths were required for the summoning of demons and the pursuit of alchemical secrets. And through it all, his daughter lived nearby. What did she know? Did she hear the cries in the night, the screams buried beneath laughter at court? Did she see the servants who suddenly vanished, or the way the priests who visited never returned a second time? History is vague about Marie. She rarely appears in records, her life a ghostly outline in the shadow of her father. But what is known is this: when Gillis faced financial ruin and political disgrace, he used her as a bargaining tool. He offered her hand in marriage not for alliance, not for love, but for survival. To secure debts, to buy silence, to barter with men who held power over his lands. His daughter, barely of age, became currency. And while arranged marriages were the norm in noble circles, this was something else. It was not about legacy or strategy. It was desperation. A man trading the last pure thing he possessed. But Gillis had already sold something far worse. He had sold himself to madness. By 1440, his crimes could no longer be hidden. The Bishop of Nantes launched an investigation, prompted by the pleas of grieving parents and wary neighbors. Witnesses emerged. Servants who had helped clean the chambers. Children who had escaped. Letters were uncovered. And eventually, Gillis was arrested and tried. In court, his confessions poured out in waves, detached, grotesque, detailed. The judges, hardened men of church and state, wept as they listened. He spoke of rituals, of summoning demons with entrails, of taking pleasure in the moment breath left a child's body. There was no remorse, only theatrical sorrow, perhaps for himself, never for the dead. And Marie. Her name was mentioned once in passing, a footnote in a story soaked in cruelty. Some sources suggest she was placed in a convent after her father's execution, cloistered from the world. Others say she married, lived quietly, and died forgotten. But the truth is likely somewhere in between, a life of silence, shaped by the unimaginable burden of being Gillis de Rice's daughter. She bore no crime, yet carried its weight. The execution came quickly. Gillis was hanged and burned in Nantes before a crowd that watched with grim fascination. As the fire consumed his body, many hoped it would purify the land, erase the stain he had left. But fire cannot cleanse memory. What makes Gillis de Rice one of the worst fathers in medieval history is not only his monstrous acts toward others, but his betrayal of the very idea of fatherhood. He had the chance to raise a daughter with love, to rebuild his soul through her eyes. Instead, he plunged deeper into the pit, dragging her name behind him, tethered to his legacy like a stone to a drowning man. Where Ivan the Terrible's violence struck in a moment of rage, Gillis' cruelty was slow, methodical, rehearsed. Ivan wept at his son's death. Gillis never wept for anyone but himself. And what of the children he murdered? Each one, someone's son, someone's daughter. They came to his gates with hope and left the world in agony. In that, Gillis de Rice became more than a failed father. He became a symbol of what happens when power is unchecked, when grief is twisted into obsession, and when the human heart turns to rot. Marie, silent through history, is the true ghost of this story. Not her father. Her absence in the records is louder than any confession. We do not know if she ever spoke of him, if she burned his name from her memory, or if she lived each day with his crimes shadowing her footsteps. But we know this: she was sold, not in the literal sense alone, but sold in spirit, used, bartered, and discarded. History does not always give voice to the victims. Often, it immortalizes the villains. But in the quiet places where children sleep, stories like this linger. Not as fairy tales, but as warnings. Power corrupts. Obsession consumes. And sometimes, the worst crimes are not those written in blood, but those written in silence. From the icy rage of Ivan in Russia to the occult chambers of Gillis in France, the path is not a line, but a circle, each man devouring his legacy, each father undoing what should have been sacred. And as we move on, we turn our gaze to a new chapter, one not of kings or nobles, but of ordinary men, who, through fear or belief, betrayed their children in a different way. Let us now walk into that story. The next act awaits. In the year 1212, Europe trembled not from the clash of armies, but from the footsteps of children. They came by the thousands, barefoot, ragged, and determined. Boys and girls, some as young as 7, walked in rows down dusty roads, their eyes fixed on the horizon. They believed, with pure and untested hearts, that God had chosen them for a mission. Not to fight with swords, but to reclaim the Holy Land with faith alone. They carried no weapons. They had no maps. Only songs, crosses carved into their palms, and a fierce conviction that innocence itself could conquer the world. This was the Children's Crusade, one of the strangest and saddest episodes in medieval history. A movement not led by kings or generals, but by children, stirred by visions and promises. But behind the hymns and prayers, behind the wide-eyed hope, another force moved in shadows: greed, ambition, and betrayal. And among the betrayers were the very adults meant to guide and protect them. Fathers, merchants, priests, some blind with religious fervor, others calculating and cold. In their hands, the children would not find salvation, but chains. The origins of the crusade are wrapped in mystery and legend. Chroniclers tell of a boy in France, Stephen of Cloyes, who claimed that Jesus had appeared to him in a vision, instructing him to lead a band of children to Jerusalem. Not to kill, but to convert. Word spread like wildfire through the villages and towns of France and Germany. Another boy, Nicholas of Cologne, also gathered a following. The idea was simple and powerful. The purity of children would succeed where the violence of adults had failed. Tens of thousands joined. Some left without telling their parents. Others were led by parents who believed this was God's will. Mothers wept on doorsteps. Fathers gave their blessings. But not all. Some fathers joined the march, claiming guardianship. Others, less noble, followed for profit. By the summer of 1212, the crusade had grown into a movement impossible to ignore. Pilgrims lined the roads. Townspeople offered bread and water. Priests tried to turn them back. But still they marched, believing that the sea would part before them, that ships would appear by divine hand, and that Jerusalem would open its gates to their holy cause. What followed was not a miracle, but a nightmare. In Marseille, the children met the first test of their dream. There, two wealthy merchants, Hugh the Iron and William the Pig, stepped forward. They offered ships. Free passage, they said. Safe journey to the Holy Land. The children rejoiced. Their prayers had been answered. Hundreds boarded the vessels, singing as the sails unfurled. The merchants waved them off, promises thick in the air. But the ships never reached Jerusalem. Some were lost at sea, wrecked in storms off the coast of Sardinia. Others sailed south, toward Egypt, toward slave markets. The truth unraveled slowly. The merchants had struck a deal with Muslim traders. The children were cargo. Sold by the dozens, chained and terrified, they vanished into foreign lands. None returned. Of the thousands who began the journey, only a scattered few ever saw home again. And among the adults who had accompanied the crusade, some had known. Some fathers, cloaked in faith, turned a blind eye, or worse, guided their own children toward the waiting ships. Their reasons were buried in shame. Perhaps they believed in martyrdom. Perhaps they saw opportunity. A child lost, a debt erased, a mouth less to feed. The motivations were complex, but the outcome was the same. Betrayal. This was not the betrayal of war or conquest, but something more intimate. The breaking of a bond between parent and child. Between protector and innocent. Trust crushed beneath the boots of greed and fanaticism. There are stories of individual children that have survived. One boy, only 9, was said to have carried a wooden cross too large for his arms. He fell again and again, but kept rising. Another, a girl from northern France, sang hymns until the moment she was dragged from the deck of a ship and sold in Tunis. Their names are gone, their graves unmarked. But their footsteps remain, echoing in the silence of history. The church, when confronted with the failure of the Children's Crusade, distanced itself quickly. There was no papal blessing for the mission. The children had acted on their own, officials claimed. But others knew better. Priests had encouraged them. Monks had written songs about their cause. In many towns, churches had held processions to see them off. The truth was inconvenient, and so it was buried. And what of the fathers? Not all were wicked. Some searched for their children for years. Some died on the roads, trying to follow the ships. But others simply turned back. Some returned to their villages with pockets lined in coin, unwilling to answer the questions that followed. Their children had vanished. That was all they said. And no one dared ask more. The Children's Crusade revealed something unsettling at the heart of medieval society. That innocence was not protected. That faith, in the wrong hands, could become a tool of destruction. And that even the bond between parent and child could be warped by fear, belief, and survival. There was no battlefield, no banner. Only a procession of lost souls, walking toward a promise that was never real. By winter, the roads were empty again. Snow covered the paths once worn by bare feet. Villages returned to silence. In some homes, candles were lit every night, waiting. In others, silence was the only prayer left. We remember the kings and generals. But history is also shaped by children who were never meant to become martyrs. And by fathers who failed them, not with swords, but with silence. Not with death, but with decisions they could never undo. This was not one father's crime, but many. A betrayal repeated in every town where a child disappeared into the long road south. A betrayal not shouted, but whispered behind closed doors. And in that whisper, the voice of trust died. Now, as we leave the fading trail of the boy crusaders behind, we move again, into royal courts where madness reigns, where crowns sit heavy on heads unfit to carry them. The next father is not a merchant, but a king. And his betrayal came not from greed, but from the unraveling of his own mind. Let us step now into France, into a time when love and loyalty were crushed beneath the weight of royal delusion. The palace of Charles VI was grand but hollow. Behind its carved stone, tall arches, and golden crests lay a silence that no music or feast could drown. It was the silence of children tiptoeing around a father they did not know. A father who sometimes called himself made of glass. A father who sometimes forgot their names. A king who once ruled with confidence but whose mind had become a prison, iron bars forged from madness. Charles was crowned at the age of 11 and officially began his reign in 1380, a boy placed on a throne too large for his shoulders. At first, he was everything a kingdom might hope for, handsome, intelligent, eager to rule with fairness. They called him Charles the Beloved. But behind the royal facade, the line of Valois carried a legacy no crown could shield, a legacy of fractured minds and inherited delusions. His descent began slowly. Headaches, bouts of rage. Then came the first break, violent, shocking, and unforgettable. In 1392, while traveling through the forest near Le Mans, Charles drew his sword and attacked his own men, killing several before collapsing in a fit of silence. No one had seen it coming. The court tried to explain it away. Fatigue, heat, sorcery. But something deeper had been stirred in him, and it would not sleep again. From that day forward, the king was no longer whole. His madness came in waves. At times, he believed he was made of glass and could shatter with a touch. He refused to bathe or change clothes. He would rage for hours, then fall into childlike sobs. He sometimes wandered the halls, unseeing, unaware he was king at all. Servants were ordered to remove mirrors, to muffle steps, to avoid eye contact. The royal household moved like shadows in a haunted house. And within that house, his children waited. Charles fathered 12 children with Queen Isabeau of Bavaria. But they were not raised by hands that held them with love. Their father, lost to delusion, became a stranger. Their mother, isolated and overwhelmed, became cold. One by one, the children were used as pieces in a game they could not understand. Politics, in medieval France, was not separate from family. It was family. Every marriage, every alliance, every betrayal bled directly into the veins of the royal line. And so, Charles's daughters were not daughters. They were currency, tools, promises wrapped in veils and sent across seas. Isabella, the king's eldest daughter, was only 6 when she was betrothed to the enemy, King Richard II of England, a man more than 20 years her senior. The 100 Years' War was supposed to find peace through her tiny hands. She was sent across the channel, dressed in silks, told she was a queen now. But when Richard was deposed and murdered, Isabella was barely 10 and already a widow in a foreign land. She returned to France not as a princess, but as a diplomatic ghost, her childhood gone, her name soaked in failed treaties. Her sister Catherine fared no better. She, too, was offered up to England. In 1420, Catherine was married to King Henry V, one of France's greatest enemies, as part of the Treaty of Troyes, a document signed during one of Charles's deepest episodes of madness. In that moment, Charles declared Henry his heir, disinheriting his own son, the Dauphin Charles. Catherine bore a child, the future Henry VI, but the marriage was short-lived. Henry died, and Catherine was left a widow at 21. She eventually remarried in secret, but her life, like Isabella's, was shaped entirely by a father's absence. The sons were no safer. The Dauphin, Charles VII, spent much of his youth disinherited, hunted, forced to build a court in exile. He watched as his father recognized the English king as his true heir. He listened as his mother, Queen Isabeau, signed away his rights. He wore the crown in name long before he could wear it in truth. And he bore the same fear as all the Valois sons. Would he go mad too? The palace that raised them had become a battlefield, not of steel and fire, but of silence, neglect, and fear. Charles VI was present in body, but not in mind. His madness did not come with violence like Ivan's, nor with perversion like Gilles de Rais. It came with distance. He was a father who vanished without leaving. His eyes were open, but they saw a world his children did not live in. There were moments of clarity. Days when Charles recognized his children, embraced them, spoke gently. But those moments were rare and unreliable. They came like sun between storms. And just as quickly, they were gone. The court was no better. Nobles circled the mad king like vultures, vying for influence, manipulating his rare lucidity to sign decrees, grant titles, or condemn rivals. The children of Charles VI grew up among plots, forced to pick sides before they could read. Uncles turned against cousins, mothers betrayed sons, and all the while, the king muttered in dark corners, his crown slipping further from reality. To be the child of Charles VI was to grow up knowing that your life was not your own. Every marriage was a treaty, every sibling a rival, every conversation a potential weapon. The cradle was never a sanctuary, it was a waiting room for the throne or for exile. In this way, Charles VI failed not through malice, but through absence. His children were not beaten, not locked away, not sold into chains, but they were abandoned. Not to poverty, but to politics. Not to strangers, but to factions. A father who could not protect them because he could not protect himself. There is something quietly tragic in that. Not all betrayal is loud. Not all wounds bleed. Sometimes, the worst harm is to be forgotten by someone who is still alive. Someone who once held your hand and then, one day, did not know who you were. When Charles died in 1422, France was still at war. The English claimed the crown. His son, Charles VII, would not officially be crowned for several more years, and only after a peasant girl, Joan of Arc, rose to guide him. The irony was bitter. The mad king's daughter had married an English king. His son had been disowned. And yet it was the son who would rebuild France. Charles VI was buried with honors. His madness had become legend by then, the stories of his glass delusions passed down with pity or awe. But his children bore the true legacy, not in legend, but in memory. In the cold years of exile. In the silence of royal chambers. In marriages that were never theirs to choose. And so, the crown sat heavier than ever. Not just gold, but sorrow. Not just authority, but absence. As we leave behind the palace of Charles VI, we find ourselves stepping out of madness into something even darker, superstition. Into a world where children were not neglected, but tormented. Where fear did not come from kings or politics, but from the fires of belief. The next act takes us into a village, not a palace. To a father not crowned, but common. Yet what he did in the name of love would echo in fear. Let us now walk into that story. The throne of Henry II stood tall in England, forged from ambition and hardened by war. He was not born to gentle peace, nor did he ever seek it. His rule stretched from the green hills of Ireland to the stone castles of Normandy, from the cold coastlines of England to the vineyards of Aquitaine. His was an empire of iron and will, carefully built, fiercely defended, and slowly, tragically, torn apart by the very sons he sired. Henry was a brilliant king, ruthless when needed, strategic by instinct. He reformed laws, strengthened the monarchy, and ruled with eyes that missed nothing. But the very drive that made him great as a ruler often made him impossible as a father. Love, to Henry, was a thing tangled in power. His children were not nurtured, they were positioned. Raised not for affection but for advantage. Among them were 4 sons, Henry the young king, Richard the Lionheart, Geoffrey of Brittany, and John, later known as Lackland. Each was groomed for authority. Each was handed titles and lands while still barely grown. And each, one by one, would turn against their father in fire and blood. But the roots of that rebellion were not only in politics, they were soaked in an earlier betrayal. One that did not begin with his children, but with a friend. Thomas Becket had once been Henry's closest companion. A man of wit, charm, and loyalty, Becket rose through the royal ranks with Henry's blessing, eventually being appointed Archbishop of Canterbury. Henry believed that putting his trusted friend in charge of the church would bring church and crown into harmony, under his rule. He was wrong. Becket changed. Robed in the power of the church, he became defiant. He defended clerical privileges, resisted royal interference, and challenged Henry's authority in public and in private. Their friendship turned to rivalry, then enmity. And in 1170, in a moment of fury, Henry is said to have uttered words that would become infamous, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 knights heard the call. Days later, they rode to Canterbury Cathedral and murdered Becket at the altar, slicing him down where he prayed. Blood pooled on holy stone. The realm recoiled. Becket became a martyr. Henry, though not holding the blade, was blamed. The public wept for the archbishop. Pilgrimages began. The king, desperate to contain the outrage, walked barefoot through the streets of Canterbury in penance, allowing monks to flog him. But something deeper had broken. Henry's sons watched. They saw their father shaken. not by battle, but by guilt. And in that guilt, a crack appeared in his rule. One that would grow wider with each passing year. Henry the young king was the first to rebel. Though crowned during his father's lifetime, he held no real power. Titles but no authority. A king in name, a boy in truth. Frustrated and manipulated by ambitious courtiers, he turned against his father. In 1173, he joined forces with his brothers Richard and Geoffrey, and even their mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, to wage war on Henry. A father at war with his children. A king hunting his own sons across France and England. The rebellions were fierce, though ultimately Henry triumphed. The sons were forced into submission. But the wounds ran deep. Trust was dead. Love had curdled into strategy. In 1183, the young king died of dysentery while still in rebellion. On his deathbed, he begged his father for forgiveness. Henry sent a ring, but did not come. The boy died alone. His grave became the first in a series of royal tombs dug not by time, but by betrayal. Then came Geoffrey. Charismatic, clever, and often cruel, Geoffrey schemed endlessly. He died in a tournament in 1186, crushed beneath a horse, spine shattered. He was 27. Another son buried with potential unfulfilled. Another grave, another regret. Only Richard and John remained. Richard, the boldest and most admired of the sons, had always hungered for his own rule. He was his mother's favorite, brave, beautiful, and fiercely independent. He wanted Aquitaine, and then the whole of England. And when Henry refused to yield, Richard allied with King Philip II of France, his father's greatest enemy. Together, they broke Henry. In 1189, sick and exhausted, Henry was cornered in Chinon. His empire slipping from his hands, he was forced to negotiate. When he saw the list of names of those who had betrayed him, one struck him like a blade: John. His youngest son, the boy he had loved most. The son he had trusted above all others. When he read John's name, Henry reportedly turned his face to the wall and said, "Now let everything end." He died days later, bitter, broken, and alone. It was a funeral with no warmth. The king who had ruled half of Europe now lay in the cold ground, betrayed by blood, surrounded only by stone. What had gone wrong? Henry II's tragedy was not in his ambition. It was in the way he tied ambition to love. His sons were never just his children, they were assets, threats, pieces in a game that could not be paused, even for grief. He taught them to hunger for power, to distrust kindness, to strike first. And when they turned those lessons against him, he was unprepared for the pain it brought. He raised kings, but not sons. Even Eleanor, his queen, spent years imprisoned by his order, punished for siding with the boys during their rebellion. Love, in Henry's court, was a fragile thing. Held tightly, but never freely given. And yet, despite everything, despite the betrayals, Henry loved his children in his own way. He tried to guide them. He wanted them to be strong, to hold his empire together. But in shaping them into rivals, he had sown the seeds of his own destruction. The Plantagenet family was one of Europe's most powerful dynasties. But its foundation was laid in conflict. Father against son, brother against brother. And so it would continue for generations. After Henry's death, Richard became king. Then John. Their reigns would bring glory and ruin. But the story begins with the father who gave them crowns before he gave them peace. In this act, we see how ambition, when unchecked, poisons even the deepest bonds. A father who built an empire, only to lose it to the very hands he raised to inherit it. From the chaos of Henry's court, we now turn toward a different kind of betrayal. One that did not come from swords, but from silence. A father whose faith cost him his daughter's voice. A man who believed in holy order, but forgot the soul standing before him. Let us walk into the next act. There is no crown in this tale, no throne room, no embroidered cloak or gilded ring, no bloodline marked in royal scrolls. This act takes place not in the courts of Europe, but in a cottage with a dirt floor, a timber roof, and walls that knew more prayers than peace. This is the story of a man whose name history has not preserved. A man who lived, worked, and died in the 14th century like countless others, unknown, unrecorded, and unremarkable. Except for what he did to his son in the name of love, or perhaps in the name of fear. It was a small village, like so many scattered across medieval Europe. A place where the sky was a god, the land was a sentence, and life moved at the speed of seasons. A place where most men were born into fields and died among them. Where every sound in the forest, every bad harvest, every fevered child could be blamed on the devil. Or on sin. Or on both. In such places, superstition was not just a belief. It was survival's compass. The peasant father was a simple man. He woke with the sun and slept beside a hearth that barely warmed the night. He believed in saints. He feared demons. He worked the soil with hands that bled, and ate from plates chipped by years of hunger. He had little, and even less certainty. His wife had died in childbirth, leaving him with 2 sons, the elder, strong and quiet. The younger, different. The boy had always been strange. He cried longer than most infants, screamed at shadows, and spoke to corners. As he grew, he startled the village priest with his fits, sudden spasms, twitching limbs, words that tumbled from his mouth in no known tongue. At night, he wailed in his sleep. During the day, he laughed when others wept and wept when others laughed. Today, we might call it epilepsy. Or a neurological disorder. Or simply a child wired differently. But in the 14th century, there was only one explanation for such things. The devil. The whispers came first. From the neighbor who crossed herself every time the boy passed her door. From the priest who warned of possession. From the midwife who remembered the strange fog the day he was born. The father, already burdened with his grief and toil, began to believe them. Not because he was cruel, but because he was terrified. And so, one evening, he took the boy into the barn. The village had no doctors, no books, no mercy for the unexplained. But it had stories. Tales of saints who cast out demons. Of holy men who laid hands on the afflicted. Of fathers who did what needed to be done to save their kin. He carried with him a birch rod, soaked in river water and blessed by the local friar. He told the boy to kneel. The child, barely 10, obeyed. Then, the beating began. With every lash, the father shouted prayers. With every cry from the boy, he believed the devil was loosening his grip. He called on Saint Michael, on the Virgin Mary, on the fire of heaven to burn away the darkness. The boy screamed. His body convulsed. His voice twisted into something the father did not understand. To the man, it was proof. He beat the child until his own arms trembled. Until the rod broke. Till his son lay silent. Then he collapsed beside him, sobbing, begging God for mercy, for both of them. But there was no mercy in that barn. Only silence. And shame. The boy survived. His wounds healed. But he never spoke again. Whether from injury, shock, or choice, no one could say. He became a ghost inside his own body, staring, nodding, breathing, but never truly present. The villagers said the devil had been driven out. That the father's faith had saved the boy's soul. They praised him. Called him strong. Called him brave. But in truth, the father never touched the rod again. He tended his fields. He fed his sons. But something inside him had changed. He would sit by the fire and watch his younger son play with stones in the ashes, making no sound. He would whisper to no one. He would wake at night, drenched in sweat, haunted not by demons, but by memory. The church did not condemn what he had done. On the contrary, it sanctioned it. Discipline was salvation. Pain was purification. The devil feared the rod, the sermons claimed. A father who beat the sin from his child was not cruel. He was righteous. And so, in homes across Europe, cries echoed behind closed doors. Children beaten for disobedience, for curiosity, for illness, for difference. The rod became a tool of love twisted by fear. Fathers wept as they struck. Mothers prayed as their children screamed. And always, the same words, "It is for your soul." There were no trials for this. No chronicles. No historians writing down the names of the children whose spirits were bent beneath the weight of faith and fear. They lived and died in silence, their stories lost in the cracks between cathedrals and castles. But that silence speaks of a world where ignorance was sacred, where superstition wore the robes of authority, where love could look like violence, and where fear of the devil was stronger than love for a child. The peasant father grew old. His elder son inherited the land. The younger, mute, inward, was kept at home, fed, clothed, but never touched. Not out of cruelty, but out of fear. The father died with the belief that he had done right. That he had saved his child from something worse. But his legacy was not salvation. It was silence. This was not a king's tragedy. It was a common one. Repeated in villages from the Alps to the Irish Sea. A tale not written in books, but etched in bruises, in hushed prayers, in the heavy tread of fathers walking toward their children with rods instead of open arms. In royal courts, betrayal was loud. It came with war, with crowns, with swords. But in the homes of peasants, it came in whispers. In the quiet terror of a child who could not explain their pain. In the love of a father too blinded by fear to see his own son clearly. And so, this act stands not for one man alone, but for many. For every child who was misunderstood. For every father who believed he was saving a soul when he was breaking a spirit. We leave now the simple cottage, the dirt floor, the broken rod. We carry with us the weight of superstition, the echo of prayers turned to punishment. And we turn once again toward power. To another father, this one wearing armor. A man whose son died not by his hand, but by the machine of battle he could not stop. A story where love and honor were crushed beneath duty. The monastery sat in the hills of Bavaria, encircled by dark fir trees and fields brushed silver by morning frost. Built of gray stone and red-tiled roofs, it looked from afar like a fortress of peace. Bells rang at measured hours. Smoke curled gently from the kitchen chimney. The monks walked its halls in silence, robed in black, their sandals whispering against cold flagstones. Inside its walls, the world was orderly, calm, austere, untouched by the noise of ordinary life. But not all silence is peace. Among the dozens of Benedictine brothers who had devoted their lives to God within those walls, one monk was known for his stillness more than most. Brother Ulrich had taken the vow of silence with rare intensity. While some monks spoke during certain hours or when performing duties, Ulrich kept his voice locked in stone. Not even the abbot remembered hearing him speak since he first took the habit more than a decade ago. He worked the scriptorium, copying manuscripts with perfect lines, his script admired as a work of near-divine precision. He was tall, pale, with sharp cheekbones and deep-set eyes. There was a sadness about him that no one named aloud. But in monasteries, questions were rarely asked. A monk's silence could be taken for piety, or for pain. No one disturbed it. Except for one boy. His name was Elias. A servant boy, perhaps 10 or 11, with hair the color of ash and a scar above his left eyebrow. No one knew where he had come from exactly. He had arrived as an infant, brought by a tradesman from a village no one visited. Raised in the guest quarters, then in the kitchens, Elias swept floors, carried firewood, fed chickens. He lived on crumbs and kindness, what little kindness a monastery could spare. The monks did not beat him, but they did not speak to him much either. They assumed he was someone's burden, now theirs to carry in God's name. But Elias was not just any child. He was Ulrich's son, born of a single act of broken vows, conceived in a moment of flesh and guilt with a woman whose name history never kept. She was a servant, perhaps a widow, perhaps a visitor whose eyes met Ulrich's one evening too long. The affair was short. Maybe it happened only once. But it was enough to leave behind a life. When she returned to her village carrying Ulrich's child, she was shunned. A few months after the birth, she was dead, fever, childbirth complications, no one could say. The baby was delivered to the monastery in a basket, along with a note that bore no name. Just a plea, raise him as your own, in God's mercy. Ulrich took the boy in. He never spoke of it. Not to the abbot, not to his brothers, not to the child himself, but he watched the boy grow. Not closely, not obviously, but always. His eyes followed Elias when he swept the halls. He slipped food into the kitchen stores. He fixed the boy's torn tunic late at night and left it folded at his door. And he never said a word. To Elias, Brother Ulrich was the man who never scolded, never praised, the man who looked at him sometimes with something unreadable in his eyes. A flicker of something Elias did not yet have the words for. He noticed their resemblance. The same long nose, the same left-handedness, the same furrow between the brows when concentrating. But the monks all looked somewhat similar in their robes and shaved crowns. He said nothing. Still, Elias followed him like a shadow. He would sweep longer in the scriptorium just to be near him. He'd sit on the far end of the bench and steal glances at Ulrich's steady hands as they inked letters onto vellum. Once, when Ulrich pricked his finger on a quill and a drop of blood fell onto the page, Elias reached for a rag without being asked. Their hands touched. Ulrich froze, then gently took the rag and turned away. That was the closest they ever came to touching as father and son. Elias began to suspect the truth in the quiet spaces between work and worship. When he fell sick one winter and found warm soup at his bedside. When the other monks forgot his birthday, but a wooden toy, a tiny carved bird, appeared near his sleeping mat. When he was wrongly blamed for stealing bread and sent to the storeroom to kneel for hours, and Ulrich passed by without stopping, but left a candle burning nearby so he wouldn't be cold in the dark. The boy never said anything. He knew it was dangerous to ask questions. He knew the rules. He knew that monks took vows. He understood that he was a mistake. And still, in the silence, he hoped. He waited for a sign. A nod. A smile. A whispered word, even one. But it never came. Ulrich grew older. His hands began to shake. His eyesight dimmed. He copied fewer books, and one day, he stopped altogether. He moved more slowly, took longer to rise from prayer. Elias, now nearing 15, still served. Taller now. Stronger. But still watching. Still waiting. One morning, Brother Ulrich did not rise for matins. The monks found him cold in his cot, eyes closed, hands folded over his chest. A peaceful death, they said. No pain, they said. Elias stood in the back of the chapel as the prayers were said. He did not cry. He did not move. He waited, heart pounding, for someone to say it. No one did. When the abbot listed Ulrich's name in the book of brothers, he mentioned his skill with the quill, his discipline, his silence. No mention of a son. No mention of love. The funeral was simple. The grave was marked with a stone and a cross. And that was all. Later that night, Elias slipped into Ulrich's old chamber. It had already been cleared, his few possessions tucked away. But on the desk, pushed far back behind the writing ink and spare parchment, was a sealed letter. The seal was unmarked, the paper aged. Inside, in a careful, trembling script, were the only words Ulrich had left behind for the boy. I am sorry. I failed to speak what mattered. You are my greatest sin, and my only joy. Forgive me. No name. No signature. Just truth. Elias did not show the letter to anyone. He folded it and kept it inside his tunic, next to his heart. He stayed at the monastery. He took vows, not of silence, but of service. He taught younger boys to read. He lit candles for his father's soul. He never said he was Ulrich's son. But every time he passed the scriptorium, he paused. Every time he taught a child to write, he traced the letters exactly as Ulrich had done. A legacy not of bloodlines, but of quiet. In this act, we see the cruelty of silence, not as punishment but as denial. A father who believed his vows mattered more than his voice. A man who saw his son every day and could not find the courage to speak one word of love. A child who lived without hate, without blame, but also without what he most needed, a name, a place, a father's arms. Some betrayals are loud. Others are quiet as breath. But they leave the same wounds. We turn now from the halls of prayer to the halls of war. To a man whose ambition cost not just his son's future, but his life. A crossbow, a throne, and a legacy written in tragedy. They called him father. Not because he held a child in his arms. Not because he sang lullabies or watched over a sleeping son. They called him father because of his collar, his robes, and his authority over souls. Tomás de Torquemada, the Dominican friar who became the first Grand Inquisitor of Spain, was no father in flesh, but to countless across the Iberian Peninsula, he became the ghostly shadow of one. Unrelenting. Watching. Waiting for the smallest error. And for thousands of children, he was a father not of safety, but of fear. The year was 1483. Spain stood on the edge of greatness. The crowns of Castile and Aragon were united under Ferdinand and Isabella. The Reconquista, the centuries-long campaign to push Muslims out of Iberia, was nearing its end. The Spanish state, hungry for order and religious unity, now turned its gaze inward. Jews who had converted to Christianity, called conversos, were viewed with suspicion. Were their conversions sincere? Did they whisper Hebrew prayers at night? Did they cling, secretly, to the faith of their ancestors? Torquemada believed they did. And for that, he devoted his life to rooting them out. He established the Holy Office of the Inquisition in Spain, a tribunal that would investigate, interrogate, and punish heresy. Its power was total. It answered not to local laws, but to Rome and to itself. And it reached everywhere, from the richest merchant's home to the poorest village shack. No family, no child, no whispered word was safe. Torquemada never had a family of his own. He took vows of celibacy, poverty, obedience. But he viewed Spain as his child. A child to be cleansed, disciplined, corrected. He believed himself a guardian of eternal souls. And in this holy mission, he became something more terrifying than any warlord, a surrogate father to a nation, cold, exacting, and pitiless. The inquisitors under him, many also called father, saw themselves as spiritual shepherds. But their care was shaped not by kindness, but by suspicion. They built vast networks of informants. Neighbors turned in neighbors. Wives accused husbands. And children, innocent or not, were pulled into the machinery. It is estimated that under Torquemada's rule, more than 100,000 people were investigated. Around 2,000 to 10,000 were executed, burned alive in public plazas, in a ceremony called an auto de fe. But long before the flames, there were dungeons. And within those, no soul was spared, not even the smallest. Children were often arrested with their families. If a parent was accused of heresy, the child was suspect by blood. If a boy was seen lighting candles in a strange way, if a girl muttered a prayer in the wrong tongue, if they hesitated under questioning, they could be imprisoned. Some were tortured to extract confessions. Others were separated from their families forever. A few, too young to fully understand, confessed to impossible sins simply to stop the pain. Imagine a boy, 9 years old, watching his mother dragged from the home. A few days later, soldiers return for him. They take him to a dark stone cell beneath the cathedral. They tell him his soul is in danger. They ask if he has seen his mother reading Hebrew. Did she cook strange meals on Fridays? Did she bathe before sundown? He says yes, because it's true, and because he doesn't yet know it is a trap. They nod. They write it down. That night, his mother is sentenced. The boy is told he has helped save her soul. He never sees her again. These stories repeat. Over and over. From Seville to Toledo, from Aragon to Valencia. A girl, 13, forced to testify against her father. A young boy whipped until he names the friends who taught him a Jewish song. A child who recants, but too late. By the logic of the Inquisition, denial is further proof of guilt. And behind it all, Torquemada. He was not a man who wept. He believed cruelty in the present would bring salvation in eternity. He fasted often. He lived modestly. He slept in a bare cell. He believed he was serving God's mercy by enforcing God's justice. When critics pleaded for compassion, he reminded them of the eternal stakes. What was one body's suffering compared to the salvation of a soul? In this twisted calculus, he was not a monster. He was a savior. And that made him all the more dangerous. To the faithful, he preached purification. To the monarchy, he offered control. And to children, he offered a distorted kind of parenting, one where obedience was demanded, innocence was ignored, and love was conditional on complete surrender. This was not guidance. It was domination, dressed in cassocks and sealed with holy seals. Some children were rescued from their families. If a household was found guilty of secret Jewish practice, the children might be taken in by Christian foster families. These homes, more loyal to doctrine than affection, raised them as model Christians. They changed their names, forbade any mention of their origins. The past was erased with each prayer they were forced to memorize. In many cases, these children grew up with no memory of their parents, just a vague sense of shame. Not all inquisitors were as ruthless as Torquemada. But the system he built normalized the idea that terror could be sacred, that love meant submission, that salvation was only possible through pain. And in this system, children became both victims and tools. Their innocence made their suffering more powerful. Their fear made them more pliable. In one recorded case from Aragon, a group of children were forced to watch their parents' public penance, clad in yellow tunics, heads shaved, shuffling barefoot through the streets. The crowd jeered. The children wept. Later, the children were questioned about what they had learned. If they answered well, they were spared. If not, they might join the procession the following week. It is easy to blame Torquemada alone. But the truth is, he did not act in a vacuum. He was supported by the crown, blessed by the Pope, and praised by many in the church. The Inquisition was not a single man, it was a culture. A hierarchy. A doctrine. Torquemada simply gave it a face. He died in 1498, in his late 60s. He was buried in the monastery of St. Thomas in Avila. His grave was marked with honor. For centuries, his name was respected by many as a holy warrior. But among the families he destroyed, among the children whose lives were shattered beneath his gaze, his name meant something else: silence, fear, betrayal. To be a child under the Inquisition was to grow up watching the door. To speak cautiously. To pray not just for protection, but for invisibility. And in this act, we see how surrogate fatherhood, when wielded by power without compassion, becomes a weapon. Torquemada never heard a child call him Papa. But he stood as a father figure nonetheless, a figure of moral authority, absolute control, and devastating consequence. From kings who abandoned their heirs to peasants who beat out demons, from monks who denied their sons to inquisitors who claimed to save souls by fire, history has no shortage of fathers who failed. Some through fear, others through pride, and some through faith twisted beyond recognition. We now descend into our final act. One more father. One more legacy. There are no monuments for them. No names carved in stone. No ballads sung in the halls of kings. The fathers in this final story were not cruel, not monstrous, not remembered for betrayal or tyranny. They were simply missing. swallowed by war, by disease, by time. They left not wounds but spaces, quiet, echoing absences that shaped the lives of those they left behind. This is the story of a village. Not a specific village, there were many, but one like countless others across medieval Europe. A hamlet of thatched roofs, with sheep in the meadows and smoke curling from low chimneys, nestled between forests and hills, too small to appear on any royal map. Life here moved slowly, ruled not by clocks or court edicts but by the sun, the seasons, and the toll of the church bell. And in the early 14th century, something began to shift. First came the whispers of war. France and England were circling one another, blades drawn. Lords demanded levies. Messengers arrived with scrolls sealed in wax, calling men to arms. A few coins changed hands. A blessing from the village priest. And then the men were gone, fathers, sons, brothers, marching down the road in rough wool and cracked boots, some with hope in their hearts, some with dread. They said it would be short. A few months. A year, perhaps. But wars, like seasons, do not follow human promises. Some of the men never returned. They died in mud, beneath foreign banners, their bones left in fields no one from the village would ever see. Others came back changed. Limps that never healed. Eyes that saw too much. Dreams interrupted by screams only they could hear. Their hands once raised in peace became hesitant, shaking. Some drank. Some wandered away again. And some, by what they had seen and done, simply withdrew into silence, unable to be what they had been. And then, as if war were not enough, came the plague. The Black Death swept across Europe like a shadow with teeth. It did not care for rank or reason. It came on rats, in breath, in unseen threads between one body and another. In the village, it arrived quietly. A cough, a fever, then a grave dug too soon. Children lost mothers, mothers lost children. Whole families vanished in the space of weeks. The church bell rang so often it cracked from the strain. When it was over, when the last of the corpses were burned, when the priest's hands trembled too much to lift the host, what remained was a village of orphans. Not all of them were truly parentless. Some had mothers, grandparents, older siblings. But the father was missing from so many hearths. And his absence wasn't marked by anger or resentment, but by something softer, more painful. A question with no answer. A space that could not be filled. These children grew up learning to do without. A lap to crawl into. Without a voice to guide them through fear. Without the solid presence of someone who once held them up and whispered promises only fathers dare to make. They learned from the land. From the women. From one another. Boys were handed plows instead of stories. Girls were handed silence instead of safety. They did not cry often, not because they did not hurt, but because no one had time to comfort them. Grief became another tool, worn, familiar, unspoken. In the evenings, the older children would sit by the fire and listen as the mothers told stories, not of dragons or saints, but of the men who had once lived here. Your father could split wood with one hand. He laughed like thunder on the roof. He carried you on his back through the snow, and you never felt the cold. These tales stitched the lost back into the fabric of daily life. They made ghosts into guardians. And yet, a story is not the same as a voice. The village raised its own. The blacksmith took in 3 boys, teaching them to hammer and bend iron. The miller's widow housed 2 girls who had lost everything. A crippled soldier sat each morning on the church steps, offering the only thing he had left, his memory. Your father was brave, he would whisper. He didn't scream. He held my hand when I was dying. That he had not died didn't seem to matter. The truth was pliable in grief. As the years passed, the children grew. The boys became men. The girls, women. Some left the village in search of something more. Others stayed, planting roots in the same soil their fathers once walked. But even in adulthood, the absence remained. An invisible thread pulling at them when they least expected it. When a son held his own child for the first time and didn't know how to soothe him. When a daughter stood at the edge of her wedding feast and wished for a hand to place hers in another's. When the crops failed, and the sky threatened rain, and they realized there was no one left to ask, "What would you do?" The fathers who had been lost to war and plague were never truly forgotten. They lived in gestures, in tools passed down, in the way a boy stood or a girl tied her hair. They lived in names. In songs hummed while hauling water. In the long silences between laughter. But absence has a weight of its own. It's not a sharp wound, like cruelty or abuse. It's softer, slower. It seeps into the corners of a life. The children of that village did not grow up angry, they grew up uncertain. They questioned their worth, their strength, their place in the world. Not because anyone told them they were weak, but because no one had ever told them they were strong. In the great halls of history, we speak often of the fathers who failed through violence, through betrayal, through arrogance. But sometimes the deepest scars are left by those who never returned. Who left not cruelty, but a silence so vast it shaped every step that followed. This act is not about blame. It is about memory. About the echoing chambers of absence that so many children lived within during the medieval centuries. About how communities tried to patch together what had been lost. And about the quiet ache that never truly leaves those who grow up without a hand to hold. The war ended. The plague receded. Life moved on. The children of the orphan village became the elders. They told the stories. They worked the fields. And when their own time came to leave, many of them whispered apologies, not to their children, but to the fathers they never truly knew. And still, the village stood. A little quieter. A little wiser. A place shaped not by great men or kings or clerics, but by those who had to grow up without them.